The worn edges of the photograph tell a story of their own, a story of time, of patience, of waiting. The black and white image shows 37 young faces, arranged in neat rows, dressed in the finest attire of 1924. Their expressions vary, some solemn, others with the faintest hint of a smile, and a few with eyes that seem to follow you around the room. This is the Radcliffe Hall class portrait, and for decades it hung in the corridor of Blackwood University's history department, largely unremarkable save for its age. Welcome to Shadow Frames. I'm your host, and today we're going to unravel the mystery of a photograph that defied explanation for nearly a century. The story begins in the autumn of 1924, when 37 students gathered on the steps of Radcliffe Hall at Blackwood University for their class portrait. The photographer, Edwin Montgomery, was known throughout New England for his precise work and attention to detail. The photograph itself was a masterpiece of composition, each face perfectly visible, the architecture of the grand hall forming an imposing backdrop. At first glance, it was simply another class portrait among thousands taken at universities across America. Nothing to distinguish it from the countless others that hung in hallways and sat in yearbooks, slowly yellowing with age. The students wore the fashion of the day. Young men in suits with high collars and slicked back hair. Young women in drop-waist dresses with bobbed cuts that defined the flapper era. They were the bright young things of their generation, full of promise in the prosperous years between the Great War and the economic collapse that would come at the decade's end. But as the years passed, something peculiar began to happen. Academics who studied the history of Blackwood University noticed odd discrepancies in the records. The names listed in the university archives didn't always match the faces in the photograph. Some students appeared in no other university records at all, as if they had materialized solely for the purpose of this portrait. In 1952, Dr. Margaret Whitmore, the university's first female department chair, began a systematic study of the photograph. She was initially drawn to it because her own mother had attended Blackwood in the 1920s, though she wasn't in this particular class. Dr. Whitmore meticulously cross-referenced the university records, alumni newsletters, and census data. She spent countless evenings in the archive room, the golden light of a desk lamp illuminating stacks of yellowed papers and leather-bound record books, the only sound the ticking of the large wall clock and the occasional rustling as she turned another page. "There's something not quite right about this photograph," she wrote in her journal, penned in an elegant script with blue-black fountain pen ink that had faded slightly over the decades. Student number 16, identified as James Harrison in our records, appears in no other university document. His family, when contacted, has no knowledge of any relative attending Blackwood, yet there he stands, clear as day, in the third row. Dr. Whitmore's fascination grew when she discovered that 3 other students in the photograph, Evelyn Prescott, Thomas Caldwell, and Dorothy Maxwell, also seemed to have no existence outside this single image. They had no academic records, no dormitory assignments, no library cards. They were ghosts in the system, present only in the silver gelatin of Edwin Montgomery's photograph. By 1963, the Radcliffe Hall portrait had become something of a quiet legend among the faculty. Dr. Whitmore published her findings in an obscure academic journal where they caught the attention of Dr. Richard Harmon, a professor of photography and visual arts at Princeton. Dr. Harmon was particularly interested in photographic anomalies and manipulation techniques from the early 20th century, when photography still straddled the line between scientific documentation and artistic expression. After examining high-quality reproductions of the photograph, Dr. Harmon made a startling discovery. He wrote to Dr. Whitmore in a letter postmarked May 17, 1963. The quality of light on 4 of the subjects differs subtly from the others. The shadows fall at slightly different angles on students 16, 22, 29, and 31. It's almost imperceptible, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I believe Mr. Montgomery may have combined multiple exposures to create this image, though why he would do so remains a mystery. The technique would have been extraordinarily difficult with the equipment available in 1924, requiring not only technical mastery, but an almost supernatural precision. Dr. Whitmore was fascinated by this theory but remained unconvinced. The technology to seamlessly combine photographs in such a manner was crude at best in 1924. Photographic manipulation existed, certainly. Spirit photography had been popular in the late 19th century, with its obvious double exposures purporting to show the dead alongside the living. But those were clumsy attempts, with ghostly, transparent figures overlaid on the main image. What Dr. Harmon was suggesting was far more sophisticated, a seamless integration that was nearly undetectable. Furthermore, Edwin Montgomery was known for his traditional approach and disdain for darkroom trickery. In an interview with the Boston Globe in 1931, he had explicitly condemned the practice, calling it a corruption of photography's noble purpose as a witness to truth. Why would a photographer of his reputation and stated principles resort to such manipulation for a simple class portrait? The mystery deepened when Dr. Whitmore managed to track down Lillian Cooper, student number 7 in the photograph, who was by then an elderly woman living in a small Connecticut town. Mrs. Cooper, née Abernathy, remembered the day the photograph was taken with surprising clarity, despite the passing of nearly 4 decades. It was unusually cold for September, she recalled during their telephone conversation, her voice thin but precise. We were all shivering on those stone steps. The girls were especially uncomfortable. Fashion at that time didn't allow for much warmth, you know. Thin silk stockings and light dresses, even as the autumn chill was setting in. We were all envious of the boys in their wool suits. She continued, describing the scene in vivid detail. Mr. Montgomery was quite particular about our positions. He moved several students around before he was satisfied. I remember being annoyed because he made us stand there for nearly an hour, adjusting our positions again and again, consulting with Dean Harrington between each attempt. The dean was there the entire time, which was unusual. Class portraits were hardly important enough to warrant the presence of the university's highest administrator. When Dr. Whitmore asked about James Harrison, Thomas Caldwell, and the other mysterious students, Mrs. Cooper paused for a long moment. The silence stretched across the telephone line, filled only with the soft static of long-distance communication in the early 1960s. I don't recall those names, she finally said, her voice noticeably more hesitant. But there were several students who kept to themselves. Some of them were only at Blackwood for a short time before transferring elsewhere. It was not uncommon in those days. Universities were more fluid, I suppose you might say. Students came and went. Not everyone completed their studies where they began them. But something in her tone suggested discomfort, as if she were deliberately avoiding a direct answer. Dr. Whitmore made a note of this in her research journal, underlining it twice. Elsie seemed reluctant to discuss the missing students, memory failing or something else. After Dr. Whitmore's death in 1978, interest in the photograph waned. It continued to hang in the corridor of the history department, occasionally drawing the curious gaze of a passing student or faculty member. The mystery of the mismatched records and strange lighting effects remained unsolved, a minor curiosity in the long history of Blackwood University. That might have been the end of the story, if not for Alexandra Pearson. Alexandra arrived at Blackwood University in the fall of 2018, a graduate student in historical archival studies. With her dark-rimmed glasses and tendency to wear vintage clothing, not as a fashion statement but because she genuinely preferred the styles of earlier eras, she looked more like a character from a period film than a modern graduate student. She had chosen Blackwood specifically for its extensive historical archives dating back to the university's founding in 1842. Her dissertation focused on the evolution of student life at prestigious New England universities, with particular emphasis on the period between the World Wars. During her second week on campus, Alexandra was wandering through the history department, familiarizing herself with the building, when she noticed the Radcliffe Hall portrait. Something about it caught her eye, perhaps the solemn gazes of the students, or the quality of light on their young faces. She found herself returning to it day after day, studying the expressions, the clothing, the positioning of each individual. There was something almost magnetic about it, she would later write in her journal. I felt as though they were trying to tell me something across the decades, especially the 4 students in the middle rows. There was an intensity to their gazes that seemed different from the others, more present somehow, more aware. Alexandra's academic advisor, Dr. Nathaniel Jenkins, noticed her interest in the photograph. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and the distracted air of someone whose mind was perpetually occupied with matters other than the present moment. He rarely took notice of his surroundings. The fact that he observed Alexandra's fascination with the portrait was, in itself, remarkable. "Ah, you've discovered our little mystery," he said with a smile, joining her in the corridor one afternoon. "That portrait has puzzled historians for years. Dr. Whitmore spent decades studying it, you know. Brilliant woman, She was department chair back when female academics were still something of a rarity. Her papers are in the university archives if you're interested. Alexandra hadn't heard of Dr. Whitmore or the portrait's mysterious reputation. Her curiosity piqued. She made her way to the university archives the following morning. The archives were housed in the basement of the university library, a grand Gothic structure built in 1898. Unlike the modern, well-lit upper floors, the archives retained an old-world atmosphere. The smell of aged paper and leather bindings, the soft yellow glow of reading lamps, the hushed silence broken only by the occasional turning of a page or the soft tap of keyboard keys. The Whitmore papers, as they were catalogued, occupied 3 large boxes in the university's special collections. Alexandra was surprised by the volume of material Dr. Whitmore had accumulated: correspondence with alumni, reproductions of the photograph with detailed annotations, newspaper clippings about Edwin Montgomery and Blackwood University in the 1920s. It was the work of a lifetime, meticulous and thorough. Alexandra spent weeks sifting through the material, initially out of curiosity, then with growing fascination. She began to notice things that even Dr. Whitmore had missed. Small details that seemed insignificant in isolation, but together formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. In photographs of campus events from 1924, she identified 29 of the 37 students from the portrait. The missing 8 students, including the 4 that Dr. Whitmore had focused on, appeared nowhere else. Furthermore, in examining the university enrollment records for 1924, Alexandra discovered that only 33 students were officially registered for the literature program associated with Radcliffe Hall. 4 extra students, she murmured to herself in the quiet of the archive room. 4 students who don't belong. But it wasn't just the numerical discrepancy that troubled her. In the original portrait, the 4 mysterious students, James Harrison, Evelyn Prescott, Thomas Caldwell, and Dorothy Maxwell, were positioned at different points in the group. But in tracing Dr. Whitmore's research, Alexandra realized something. Over time, in different reproductions of the photograph, their positions seemed to subtly shift. In a reproduction from 1945, James Harrison appeared to be slightly closer to the edge of the group than in the original. In a 1972 university publication, Dorothy Maxwell's position had changed by perhaps half an inch, hardly noticeable unless one was specifically looking for it. Photographs don't change, Alexandra whispered, comparing the reproductions side by side. The people in them don't move. Yet somehow, these 4 had. Alexandra's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Edwin Montgomery's photography career, she discovered that he had maintained detailed appointment books, which were now part of a collection at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Arranging to view these records, Alexandra found the entry for September 15, 1924, the day the Radcliffe Hall portrait was taken. Montgomery's elegant handwriting noted, Blackwood University, Radcliffe Hall students, 3 p.m. Note, special arrangement as discussed with Dean Harrington. Silver nitrate prepared according to specifications. Latin text reviewed and memorized. God help us all. Special arrangement. Silver nitrate prepared according to specifications. Latin text. These were hardly the notes one would expect for a routine class portrait. Alexandra underlined these words in her notebook, her hand trembling slightly. What special arrangement had Montgomery made with the dean? Why would a class portrait require specially prepared photographic materials? And what Latin text was significant enough to memorize and to invoke divine protection? Armed with this new information, Alexandra returned to Blackwood and requested access to the personal papers of Dean William Harrington, who had overseen the university from 1919 to 1932. These papers had never been fully cataloged and sat in dusty boxes in a corner of the university archives. Most researchers focused on the official administrative records, ignoring the personal correspondence and journals as irrelevant to academic history. For 3 days, Alexandra methodically worked through Harrington's correspondence, meeting minutes, and personal journals. The dean had been a meticulous record keeper, documenting everything from university budget meetings to the condition of campus buildings to his observations of promising students. His handwriting was precise, his language formal even in his private journals, revealing a man who rarely allowed himself to express emotion or personal opinion. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as the autumn sunlight slanted through the high windows of the archive room, casting long shadows across the reading table, Alexandra found it, a letter from Edwin Montgomery, dated September 2, 1924, just 2 weeks before the portrait was taken. Dear Dean Harrington, it read, I have considered your unusual request regarding the Radcliffe Hall portrait, and, while I have reservations about such manipulation, I understand the sentiment behind it. I will need photographs of the 4 young men in question, taken from a similar angle if possible. The results cannot be guaranteed to be perfect, but I will endeavor to honor their memory in the way you have requested. The materials you provided are unlike any I have encountered in my professional career, and I confess I am uncertain about incorporating them into the photographic process. However, I trust your judgment in this matter, as I have in all our previous dealings. Yours sincerely, Edwin Montgomery. Alexandra's heart raced as she read these words. The manipulation wasn't a photographer's trick or an artistic choice. It was done at the specific request of the dean. But why? Who were these 4 students that needed to be added to the portrait? And why was honoring their memory so important? And what unusual materials had Harrington provided to Montgomery? The answer came from the university's student newspaper archives. Alexandra spent a full day scanning through issues from 1923 and early 1924, looking for anything that might explain the dean's request. The newspapers of the era were different from modern student publications, more formal in tone, focused primarily on academic achievements and official university events, rather than student life or controversy. But they did report on significant campus events, including accidents, deaths, and other tragedies. In the March 7, 1924 issue, she found a front-page headline that made her blood run cold. Tragedy strikes Blackwood. 4 students lost in laboratory fire. The article detailed a devastating fire that had swept through the chemistry building on the evening of March 5, 1924. 4 students who had been working late on an experiment perished in the blaze. James Harrison, Evelyn Prescott, Thomas Caldwell, and Dorothy Maxwell. The same 4 students who appeared in the portrait but in no other university records. The same 4 students whose lighting looked slightly different, according to Dr. Harmon's analysis. The same 4 students whose positions seemed to shift subtly in different reproductions of the photograph. They weren't missing from the records. Alexandra whispered to herself, the newspaper trembling in her hands. They were dead before the portrait was even taken. Further research revealed the full story. The 4 students had been particularly bright, involved in an advanced chemistry project under the guidance of Professor Albert Thornton. James Harrison was a senior, described in the newspaper as brilliantly innovative and destined for a distinguished scientific career. Evelyn Prescott was one of the few female chemistry students at Blackwood, having fought for her place in a program that rarely accepted women. Thomas Caldwell came from a wealthy Boston family with a long history at Blackwood, while Dorothy Maxwell was a scholarship student from rural Vermont, the first in her family to attend university. They had been working on a new compound that, ironically, was intended to improve fire-resistant materials. A miscalculation led to a catastrophic reaction, and by the time help arrived, the laboratory was engulfed in flames. The newspaper account was tactfully vague about the condition of the bodies, but Alexandra found more graphic details in the official report to the university trustees, which described the remains as unrecognizable and strangely altered by the extreme heat and chemical exposure. The university had mourned them deeply. They had been popular students with promising futures ahead of them. Dean Harrington had been particularly affected by the tragedy, having personally recruited several of them to Blackwood. In a letter to the Board of Trustees, he described the loss as not merely a personal tragedy for their families, but an incalculable loss to science and to the future of Blackwood University. When the time came for the annual class portrait, a tradition that the 4 students had been eagerly looking forward to, according to letters Alexandra found from their classmates, Dean Harrington couldn't bear the thought of them being excluded. In an act of both sentimentality and respect, he asked Montgomery to somehow include them in the portrait. Montgomery, known for his traditional approach, had initially been reluctant, but the dean's plea touched him, and he agreed to attempt what was, at that time, a challenging photographic manipulation. Using individual portraits of the 4 students from university files, he carefully incorporated their images into the class portrait. The result was a technical masterpiece for its time, so well executed that it took decades and specialized analysis to detect the manipulation. The 4 deceased students stood among their classmates, eternally young, eternally present. To the casual observer, there was nothing to indicate that they had not been on those steps that autumn day in 1924. But Alexandra felt there was more to the story. The reference to specially prepared silver nitrate and Latin text in Montgomery's appointment book suggested something beyond simple photographic manipulation. And why would the positions of the 4 students appear to shift in different reproductions? In her final report on the Radcliffe Hall portrait, Alexandra wrote, "What we perceived as a mystery was actually a memorial." The portrait was not just a record of who was present that day, but a testament to who should have been there. Dean Harrington and Edwin Montgomery created not just a photograph, but a moment that never happened, a moment that rewrote a tragedy, if only within the borders of a silver gelatin print. Alexandra's discovery fundamentally changed how the university viewed the portrait. Rather than an oddity or a curiosity, it became a touching example of early 20th century memorial practice. The portrait was moved from the corridor to a more prominent position in the university museum, accompanied by a plaque explaining its unique history and the story of the 4 students who had been so lovingly included. But that's not where the story ends. As Alexandra continued her research, she began to notice other peculiarities in the university's historical records from that era. Deaths that were perhaps too conveniently explained, students who transferred abruptly, leaving no forwarding address, professors whose promising careers ended suddenly due to health concerns or family matters. And always at the edges of these stories, the name of Professor Albert Thornton, the chemistry professor who had supervised the 4 students who died in the fire. Professor Thornton's official faculty photograph showed a man in his early 40s with receding dark hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a severe expression. His eyes, even in the formal portrait, seemed to contain a peculiar intensity, not the stern gaze of an academic, but something more feverish, more desperate. In the university archives, Alexandra found Thornton's academic papers and research notes. Most were straightforward scientific documents, detailed records of experiments and their results. His field was organic chemistry, with a particular focus on compounds that could alter the properties of common materials, making them more resistant to fire, water, or corrosion. Practical research with clear industrial applications. But among these conventional papers was a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with increasingly erratic handwriting. In it, Thornton described experiments that went far beyond conventional chemistry. The journal began normally enough, with observations about student progress and notes on research directions. But around November 1923, the tone changed dramatically. "The boundary between states is more permeable than we have been led to believe," he wrote in one entry dated November 17th. "Matter, energy, consciousness, these are not separate realms, but aspects of a unified whole. E and J have made remarkable progress with the compound. I believe we are close to a breakthrough." The journal entries became more cryptic as they approached March 1924. Thornton made references to the veil thinning and glimpses beyond. There were diagrams that resembled no chemical structures Alexandra had ever seen. Circular arrangements of symbols that looked more like ancient occult sigils than scientific notation. Calculations filled the margins, but they weren't any mathematical system taught in universities. They included symbols Alexandra didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic that eluded conventional understanding. In his final entry, dated March 4th, 1924, the day before the fatal fire, he wrote, "Tomorrow we make the final attempt. If we succeed, science will never be the same. If we fail, but we will not fail. We stand on the precipice of the greatest discovery in human history. We have glimpsed what lies beyond the membrane of reality, and tomorrow we will tear it open. May God forgive us for what we are about to do." Alexandra cross-referenced these entries with newspaper accounts of the fire. The official report stated that the blaze was caused by a chemical reaction gone wrong, but eyewitness accounts described strange lights emanating from the laboratory windows moments before the fire erupted. One janitor, quoted in a small local newspaper rather than the university's official publication, claimed to have heard unearthly screams and seen shapes that ain't natural through the laboratory door just before the explosion. "It weren't no ordinary fire," the janitor, William Peterson, told the reporter. "I've been working at this university for 15 years and I seen chemical fires before. They don't burn blue and green like that one did. And they don't make noises like voices speaking in tongues. I don't care what the official report says. Something happened in that lab that weren't just chemistry." Professor Thornton himself survived the fire physically unharmed. having left the laboratory shortly before the accident. He resigned from his position at Blackwood just 2 weeks later, citing nervous exhaustion. He moved to a small town in Vermont and lived as a recluse until his death in 1956, never publishing another academic paper or maintaining any contact with former colleagues. His obituary in the local newspaper was brief, noting only that he had once been a professor and had no surviving family. Alexandra's research took her to the small Vermont town where Thornton had spent his remaining years. The local historical society had a few documents related to the former professor, primarily legal papers and property records. But the town librarian, an elderly woman named Martha Sullivan with silver hair and arthritis-twisted hands, remembered stories about the strange professor from her childhood. "My grandmother cleaned house for him once a week," Martha told Alexandra over tea in her small apartment above the library. The room was cluttered with books and cats, the air heavy with the scent of Earl Grey and old paper. She said his walls were covered with photographs and diagrams, not just in his study but in every room, even the bathroom, like he couldn't bear to be anywhere without them. "Photographs of what?" Alexandra asked, her tea cooling untouched before her. "Of those students mainly, the ones who died in the fire. He had their university portraits enlarged. Grandmother said he would talk to them sometimes late at night. She could hear him through the door when she arrived in the morning, apologizing over and over." "Apologizing to whom?" Alexandra asked. Martha shrugged, the motion making her wince slightly as her arthritic shoulders protested. Grandmother assumed it was to his dead students. Everyone knew that story, even here. He blamed himself, naturally. But she hesitated, her roomy eyes suddenly distant, as if seeing something beyond the cluttered apartment. "But what?" Alexandra prompted. "Grandmother said something odd once. She said it wasn't guilt that aided him, it was fear. When I asked what he was afraid of, she just shook her head and said, 'Some questions are doors, and not all doors should be opened.'" In Thornton's former house, now a quaint bed and breakfast called the Hawthorne Inn, Alexandra arranged to stay in what had once been his study. The current owners had renovated extensively, but the original stone fireplace remained. While examining it, Alexandra noticed that one of the stones seemed slightly different from the others, not in color or size, but in how it was set into the mortar. The edges were more precisely cut, the stone itself a shade darker than those surrounding it. After ensuring she was alone, she gently pressed and prodded the stone until it shifted, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a metal box, approximately the size of a thick book. The box was locked, but the decades-old mechanism gave way easily when Alexandra applied pressure with a letter opener. Inside the box was a single photograph and a handwritten letter. The photograph showed the 4 students who had died in the fire, James, Evelyn, Thomas, and Dorothy, standing in front of the chemistry building. They were smiling, unaware of the fate that awaited them, but it was the background of the photograph that sent a chill down Alexandra's spine. Behind the students, barely visible in a second-floor window of the building, was a face. Not a human face, but something else. Something with proportions that seemed subtly wrong, with eyes too large and too dark, with a mouth that stretched too wide across what should have been a face. Alexandra's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. It was dated March 6, 1924, the day after the fire, and addressed simply, "To whom it may find." "I cannot undo what has been done," Thornton had written in a shaky hand. "The experiment succeeded beyond our wildest expectations, but we were not prepared for what came through. The fire was not an accident. It was the only way to close what we had opened, and even then, I fear it was not enough. They are gone, my bright, brave students, consumed not by flames but by something far worse. I told the university it was a chemical accident. What else could I say? That we had torn the veil between worlds? That we had invited something ancient and hungry into our reality?" The letter continued. "I see them sometimes, at the edge of my vision, not as they were, but as they are now, changed, watching, waiting. I do not know what they want or if anything of their original selves remains. I include this photograph as evidence, the only clear image I have of the entity that came through. It was there for weeks before the incident, watching us work, though none of us saw it at the time. The camera caught what our eyes could not perceive. If you are reading this, then perhaps you have noticed other inconsistencies, other mysteries surrounding that terrible spring. My advice to you is simple. Stop, close this box, replace it in its hiding place, and walk away. Some knowledge is too dangerous. Some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again. Alexandra sat motionless in the fading afternoon light, the letter clutched in her hand. Everything she had discovered about the Radcliffe Hall portrait suddenly appeared in a new and terrifying context. The 4 students hadn't just died in a tragic accident. According to Thornton, they had fallen victim to something beyond human understanding, something they themselves had helped to summon. But was it true? Or were these the ravings of a guilt-ridden man who had lost his students in a terrible accident and couldn't bear the responsibility? Alexandra carefully photographed the letter and the photograph, then returned them to the metal box. Despite Thornton's warning, she couldn't simply walk away. Not when she was so close to understanding the full truth behind the portrait that had fascinated her for months. Back at Blackwood, Alexandra examined the Radcliffe Hall portrait with new eyes. The 4 students who had been added posthumously, James, Evelyn, Thomas, and Dorothy, looked like any other students at first glance. Young, well-dressed, with the serious expressions typical of formal portraits from that era. But when Alexandra looked closer, when she really studied their eyes, there was something off about them. The light reflected in their eyes didn't match the others. It wasn't just a matter of the photographic manipulation that Montgomery had performed. It was as if the light was coming from a different source entirely, or as if what was reflected in their eyes wasn't light at all, but something else. Alexandra enlarged the image as much as possible without losing clarity. In the pupils of all 4 deceased students, barely visible even under magnification, was a shape. The same shape, something that resembled a door or a gateway, surrounded by symbols that Alexandra didn't recognize from any known language or magical tradition. The symbols matched those in Thornton's journal. Further research in the university archives revealed that in the months following the fatal fire, several other students and faculty members reported strange experiences. Lights that moved on their own in the burned-out shell of the chemistry building, voices whispering from empty rooms, objects that disappeared only to reappear in impossible locations. Most disturbing were the reports of seeing the 4 deceased students around campus, glimpsed at a distance, always just turning a corner or entering a doorway, never directly confronted. "I know it couldn't have been Dorothy," wrote one female student in a letter to her parents, dated April 1924. "Dorothy died in the fire. Everyone knows that. But I saw her last night, standing under the elm tree near the women's dormitory. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just looked at me with the strangest expression. Not sad, not happy, just watchful. And then she walked behind the tree, and when I followed, she was gone." Similar accounts appeared in private correspondence and journals, though never in official university documents. A mathematics professor reported seeing Thomas Caldwell sitting in his usual seat during a lecture, only to find the seat empty when he looked again. A librarian described finding James Harrison's distinctive fountain pen on her desk each morning for a week, though the pen had reportedly been destroyed in the fire. These reports were collected by the university administration but never made public. Dean Harrington himself conducted most of the interviews, documenting each incident in his elegant handwriting before filing the reports in a locked cabinet in his office. The reports were discovered by Alexandra in a box of miscellaneous administrative documents, misfiled and forgotten for decades. Alexandra found a pattern in the sightings. They increased in frequency throughout the spring and summer of 1924, reaching their peak in early September, just before the Radcliffe Hall portrait was taken. After the portrait was completed, the sightings stopped completely. Not a single incident was reported after September 15, 1924. The truth began to take shape in Alexandra's mind, a truth more complex and more unsettling than a simple ghost story. The special arrangement that Dean Harrington had made with photographer Edwin Montgomery wasn't just a sentimental gesture to include deceased students in their class portrait. It was something far more deliberate and desperate. Alexandra returned to Montgomery's appointment books at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, this time focusing on his personal notes rather than his professional schedule. In a small notebook from 1924, she found entries that took on new significance in light of what she now knew. Meeting with Dean H. regarding the Blackwood matter, Montgomery wrote on August 30th. He explains the situation in more detail, reluctant to be involved, but he is desperate. The continuing incidents are taking a toll on the university. If what he suggests could work, and later, on September 10th, preparations complete for the Blackwood portrait. The special materials have arrived from Boston. I have never attempted anything like this before, and pray I will never need to again. This goes beyond photography into something else entirely. The Latin phrases Dean H. provided must be followed precisely. The silver nitrate has been prepared according to his instructions, exposed only to moonlight, never to the sun. The glass plates have been etched with the symbols. God help me, I feel I am participating in something that borders on blasphemy. Yet if the dean is correct, it may be the only way to end the haunting. Alexandra searched Dean Harrington's papers again, looking specifically for anything related to occult practices or containment rituals. In a small leather-bound book hidden within a hollowed-out copy of Paradise Lost, she found what she was looking for, a ritual designed to bind wandering spirits to a physical object. The ritual required several specialized ingredients, including silver nitrate prepared under a full moon, a key component in photographic plates of that era, and the voluntary participation of those who had known the deceased in life. The final step involved capturing the images of the spirits within a silver gelatin print, while reciting specific Latin incantations. The portrait wasn't just a memorial, Alexandra whispered to herself as the pieces fell into place. It was a trap. Dean Harrington and Edwin Montgomery hadn't simply added the 4 students to the portrait out of sentimentality. They had performed an arcane ritual disguised as a class portrait session, using Montgomery's photographic expertise and Harrington's knowledge of ancient binding rituals to capture whatever had come through from the other side, entities that were using the forms of the deceased students to manifest in our world. The special arrangement was a carefully orchestrated exorcism and binding, with the unwitting participation of the entire Radcliffe Hall class of 1924. The living students in the photograph weren't just classmates mourning their lost friends. They were essential components in a ritual that would contain entities from beyond our reality. But the most disturbing revelation came when Alexandra discovered a small notebook hidden within the frame of the portrait itself. When the portrait was temporarily removed from the wall for cleaning and reframing, Alexandra noticed that the backing was newer than the frame, suggesting it had been replaced at some point. Carefully removing it, she found a slim volume wedged into the wooden frame. The notebook contained entries written by Dean Harrington, continuing for years after the portrait was taken. Annual observations, documenting his regular examinations of the photograph. 1925. The binding holds. Their expressions remain unchanged. The university has been quiet this year. 1926. No incidents reported. The photograph shows no alterations. 1930. I confess I was concerned when the frame cracked last winter, but the image itself remains intact. They are still contained. The final entry was dated 1932, shortly before Harrington's death. I fear what will happen when I am gone. Who will maintain the vigil? Who will notice if they begin to break free? I have arranged for the portrait to remain in place as long as the university stands. It must never be destroyed. That would release them. It must never be altered. That would weaken the binding. It must simply hang, unremarked and undisturbed, holding its secret and its prisoners for as long as silver and paper can last. Alexandra realized she was possibly the first person since Dean Harrington to understand the true purpose of the Radcliffe Hall portrait. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a prison, holding entities that had crossed from another reality, entities that had consumed 4 bright young students and attempted to enter our world using their forms. And for decades, it had worked. The portrait had hung in the corridor, its secret purpose fulfilled, containing what should not exist in our reality. Even Dr. Whitmore's extensive studies hadn't disturbed the binding. She had focused on the historical discrepancies rather than the photograph itself. But now, nearly a century after it was created, the portrait had been moved to the University Museum. It had been removed from its frame for restoration. Its backing had been replaced. The careful obscurity that Harrington had counted on for protection had been stripped away, replaced with prominence and attention. Alexandra examined the most recent professional photographs of the portrait, taken for the museum catalog just weeks earlier. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The 4 posthumously added students, James, Evelyn, Thomas, and Dorothy, looked the same as they had in 1924. But when she magnified the images and compared them with earlier reproductions from Dr. Whitmore's time, Alexandra noticed a subtle difference. The strange symbols that had been visible in the pupils of the 4 students had changed. The door-like shape was no longer closed. It was open, just slightly, just enough. And in the latest photograph, taken just days ago for a university publication, Alexandra noticed something that sent ice through her veins. In the original portrait and all subsequent reproductions until recently, The 33 living students and 4 deceased students were arranged in precise rows. But in this newest image, the positions had shifted minutely. The 4 bound students were now slightly closer to the edges of the photograph. They were moving. Alexandra immediately contacted Dr. Jenkins, the museum curator, and the university president, sharing her discoveries and her fears. Initially skeptical, they became convinced when Alexandra demonstrated the progressive changes in the photograph over time, especially the accelerated changes since the portrait had been moved and restored. "The binding is weakening," Alexandra explained, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Whatever Dean Harrington and Montgomery did in 1924, it's beginning to fail. The entities they trapped are finding ways to slip through the cracks." Within hours, the portrait was removed from public display. Consulting with experts in both art conservation and occult history, the university established a new protocol for the Radcliffe Hall portrait. It would be returned to its original frame, with the backing carefully restored. It would be kept in a secure, climate-controlled room, away from public view, and it would be monitored regularly for any further changes. As Alexandra watched the conservation team carefully place the portrait in its restored original frame, she noticed something that no one else seemed to see. For just a moment, as the portrait was tilted toward the light, the expression on James Harrison's face seemed to change. The solemn look gave way to something else. A smile, perhaps, but not one of warmth or happiness. It was the smile of someone who knows something you don't, who sees something you can't. And then it was gone, and James Harrison's face was once again frozen in the formal expression of a 1920s university student, indistinguishable from the others around him. Alexandra's discovery had not just solved a historical mystery, it had potentially prevented a catastrophe. Whatever had come through in that chemistry laboratory in 1924, whatever had taken the forms of James Harrison, Evelyn Prescott, Thomas Caldwell, and Dorothy Maxwell, remained bound within the silver and paper of Edwin Montgomery's portrait. For how long, no one could say. Silver tarnishes, paper deteriorates, no binding lasts forever. In her final report on the Radcliffe Hall portrait, submitted as part of her dissertation, Alexandra wrote, "The photograph serves as both historical document and warning. It reminds us that not all knowledge is beneficial, that some doors are better left unopened, and that the most dangerous discoveries may be those we are not prepared to understand." The 4 students whose images were added to the portrait paid the ultimate price for reaching beyond the boundaries of conventional science. Their legacy is not what they discovered, but what Dean Harrington and Edwin Montgomery did to contain it. The Radcliffe Hall portrait remains in its secure location at Blackwood University to this day. Few people know its true significance or the real reason why it is kept isolated and protected. To most, it's simply a curious footnote in the university's history, a portrait where a photographer and a dean worked together to memorialize 4 students lost in a tragic accident. But Alexandra Pearson knows the truth. She checks the monitoring system regularly, watching for any changes in the positions of the 4 bound students. So far, they remain in place, their expressions unchanged, the open doorways in their eyes no wider than before. So far. Before we end, there's one final detail that Alexandra discovered but chose not to include in her official report. In the most recent high-resolution scan of the portrait, focusing on the background rather than the students, she noticed something in one of the windows of Radcliffe Hall, a face, not clearly defined but unmistakably present, watching the portrait session from inside the building. The face bears a striking resemblance to Professor Albert Thornton, who by all official records was no longer at Blackwood University on the day the portrait was taken, and behind him, partially obscured by shadow, other shapes. Waiting. This has been Shadow Frames. Remember, some photographs don't just capture a moment in time. Some capture things that exist outside of time altogether, and sometimes the most important part of the picture is what remains just outside the frame, watching and waiting for its chance to step into the light.